I'm Marcy Sorg. I'm from the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center, and I'm going to be introducing Kiley Daley this morning. Dan, should I just go ahead, or do you have anything that you need to say?
No, go on. Thank you very much, Marcy.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right. Yeah. Kiley just joined us at the Margaret Chase Smith Center about a year ago, and we're very happy to have him here. I think he will find, and you all will find, that he has a lot of commonalities with CCI and other programs on campus. He has a PhD in environmental studies and public health from Dalhousie. And he's particularly interested in human health risk assessments and rural health. And he's done a lot of work in the Arctic over the last 10 years. And so I'm just going to say, Kiley, why don't you go ahead with your presentation?
All right, thanks so much, Marcy, and thanks everyone. There's a few folks here that I've met before, and many others I haven't, so thank you very much for taking the time to attend today. I think I'll just go ahead and share my slides right now and get right into it. And Marcy, does that look okay? Maybe you can give me a thumbs up if everything's showing up. Thank you. Great, well, thanks for the introduction, Marcy. As Marcy said, my name's Kiley Daley. I'm a research associate over at the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. And again, thank you to Dr. Maskey and everyone at the Climate Change Institute for inviting me to join you today. What we're going to do today is I'll tell you a bit more about myself and my background, my research program in general, which leads to my interest in and joining and collaborating with people at the Climate Change Institute. And as a way of bringing that all together, I'll show some examples from some of my PhD dissertation research on water, sanitation, and Inuit health in Nunavut, Canada. So as Marcy mentioned in my introduction, I have a PhD in environmental studies and public health. That's from Dalhousie University that I finished last fall in 2020. My current work is more on the policy research side over at the Policy Center in support of various state agencies, including the Office of Behavioral Health. What I'll talk about today is my more primary research program, which would be socio-ecological systems in health. So my research is situated at the intersection of humans and environments. So that means finding ways to effectively integrate social and health sciences with an understanding of the biophysical environment as well. And within that broad theme of socio-ecological systems and health, I would say there's four major areas. So we'll start on what will be my top left, climate change and health. So that includes things like heat-related mortality and morbidity, changes to vector-borne disease distribution, also includes things like changes to humans' place-based connections, and things like exacerbated food security, climate migration, and also included in that, but what I have separated as this would be one of my key areas, would be water, sanitation, and health. Some people may be familiar with the global acronym WASH. So that's also included in climate change and health, most certainly. And that includes what we might typically think of, things like water quality, water quantity issues, waterborne disease, but there's also the broader social elements of water access and health equity encompassed within that theme. And now down shaded in green, rural, indigenous, and Arctic communities. So we know that higher burdens of climate health impacts are often experienced by those with direct reliance on their immediate environment or those with lower socioeconomic status. So those groups can often include Indigenous peoples, rural communities, and fishers and farmers specifically, given their direct connection to their immediate environment. And as Marcy did mention a bit, specifically, I have some regional expertise in the Arctic. So through my graduate studies research and a number of other projects, I have been working with Arctic communities on environmental health research for about 10 years. And my wife and I also lived in the Arctic territory of Nunavut for 2 years, full-time in between our undergrad and graduate studies. And then finally here in the research program is participatory risk assessment and epidemiology. So that would be from the research design perspective. So a lot of the work I do uses methodologies from those themes. And like I said, often with a participatory element. So that means finding ways to creatively integrate, but robustly integrate more knowledge, that social knowledge of the types of interactions and the way that these some of these specific communities that I talked about are interacting with their environment and potentially being exposed to harmful contaminants, and including those participatory elements in some of the standard methodologies. So I'm going to move into my some examples from my actual research now. And what I hope you'll see is how I've been able to draw across these themes into my project and my work. And so specifically, we're going to talk today about water, sanitation, and Inuit health in Nunavut, Canada. You can see here from this picture that we'll talk a little bit more about the wastewater side than the drinking water side today. So some of you at the Climate Change Institute may be familiar with the Arctic territory of Nunavut, Canada, and maybe some of you aren't. So I'll just start with a bit of an overview here. And as I go through this introduction and through the entire research presentation, what I think is something that you could keep in mind is that really what this is a story of a people's balancing their semi-nomadic traditions with life in permanent settlements. So the food harvesting cultures and traditions are still very important and still ingrained in their lifestyle, as you see, but now these need to be balanced with the things, the public health safety measures and the things that we need when we live in permanent settlements in terms of managing our wastewater. So Nunavut became its own separate territory in 1999 through a lands claim agreement. That was when it separated from the Northwest Territories, becoming its own distinct territory. It has a population of about 35,000, and about 84% of the entire population are the Indigenous people, the Inuit. Within this huge landmass, so it's over 2 million square kilometers, so we're talking about an area about the size of Mexico. We have 25 remote communities. So typically these are all very small communities of a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 people. And none of these communities are connected to one another with permanent roads, or they're also not connected to other more southern, more populated urban areas of Canada. So we're talking about fly-in or sea access only with no connecting roads. And we'll see that the reason that this becomes important is that all of these small isolated communities will require their own waterworks, their own drinking water and treatment systems. Also, a bit more background, here's just some temperature and precipitation info about Nunavut. So the main takeaway here just being that we essentially are below freezing from about mid-September all the way up through mid-May. And you can see in the table there on the lower right, we have the daily average daylight. So in December, we're talking only about 4.5 hours of daylight per day. And then in our summer hours, we're up over 20 hours. And again, these things are important when we learn about people's lifestyle, also in wastewater treatment, and then the way they may become exposed when those two things interact. So a bit of an overview of Arctic waterworks. So given the extreme climate in this region, basically there's no utilidors, there's no underground pipes, there's no what we would call sewers. So everybody needs water delivered to their house by truck. So in the first picture here, we see a water truck delivering water to someone's home. On the inside here, we see a water storage tank. So every dwelling, every building is fitted with one of these, and you get water delivered to your home 2 or 3 times a week. Wastewater is handled very similarly. There's a separate tank where the wastewater is deposited. It's usually in a covered area of the home, highly insulated. And again, another truck comes and pumps out your dwelling every few days. From there, for now, I'll just say that they're using very basic wastewater treatment processes. We're going to talk a bit more about that in detail, but this last picture here, you can see the truck backing up to a wastewater treatment area and discharging. So that was a quick overview on the wastewater utilities, that side of my research in Nunavut, and now just a little bit on the overall health picture for Inuit people in Nunavut specifically. So given the remote location, the health access just isn't the same as what it is in the rest of Canada and other parts of North America. So we don't really have as good of data. We don't have as good of incidence data of particular diseases or conditions. So we're really reliant on vital statistics when we want to get a picture of the health of Inuit people. So here's one of the highest level indicators. This is life expectancy at birth. So age expectancy overall. So you can see that the difference between Nunavut and the Canadian average is about 10 years. And again, with not having readily available data coming from healthcare, we're also really reliant on self-reported health studies in the territory. So this is just one example that's specifically about food and waterborne illness and acute gastrointestinal illness specifically. So this is getting closer to talking about actual exposure leading to waterborne disease. So the 3 lower bars, Hamilton, Ontario, British Columbia, and Ontario, these are 3 southern Canadian regions. And you can see here on the y-axis, we have estimated annual incidence. So it's about 1.2, 1.3. That would be about standard in Canada and similar in the US. But then these 2 bars on the right, these are Inuit communities. So we have Rigolet, Labrador, as well as Iqaluit, Nunavut. So you can see here that the estimated annual incidence is, it's upwards of 3. So we're talking over double what it is in the rest of the country.
Kylie, you have a question that's come in through the chat.
Okay.
And I don't know whether you want to take that now or a little bit later, but question was why they couldn't build the underground pipes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Sure, yeah. I will spend a minute on that now. Good question. So I just went back to this slide with the picture of the water services. So it mainly has to do with permafrost. It's just the instability. So these keeping these pipes, getting them buried, keeping them from freezing, keeping water flowing through them would be next to impossible. We do have a few communities actually in the Northwest Territories that have what they call a utilidor system. So the sewer system, the pipes are actually above ground a foot or 2 on this series of platforms and boardwalks that mazes through the entire community. Those seem to be retired. There's 2 or 3 of those that are still in operation across the Canadian and Alaskan Arctic. They are just incredibly costly to keep running and haven't been very successful. So for that reason, it's truck water primarily. Thank you for the question. And that's fine, Marcy. If you have any, that'd be great. So I had been providing a bit of background there on the way the water system works, and then the overall health picture, and a little bit about food and waterborne disease specifically within Nunavut. So keeping all that in background in mind, what was of interest to me was, given these basic wastewater treatment systems and these high rates of gastrointestinal illness, is there any connection between there? My hypothesis being that there may certainly be, given that wastewater, partially treated wastewater effluent was being discharged back into the environment with a population that's really reliant on that local environment. So that led to the specific objective of the study, which was to characterize the probability of illness associated with specific scenarios using acute gastrointestinal illness as the health outcome. And then secondly, once we were able to characterize that baseline risk, coming up with some ideas of how to mitigate it. So evaluating some mitigation and management strategies. And what I'll talk about for the rest of the presentation, we'll kind of cut across 3 papers on this topic. So back to the wastewater treatment systems again, just briefly, with the key message being their limitations. So typically across Nunavut, there's 2 types of systems. So we have mechanical systems, which consist of a wastewater treatment plant that essentially just provides primary filtration and then discharges directly to the marine environment. And then much more common are passive systems. And what they entail are a wastewater stabilization pond, often called a lagoon. These wastewater stabilization ponds are sometimes engineered, meaning they are sometimes built. In other cases, they were an existing pond or small lake on the edge of the community that at some time was decided to be used for the wastewater lagoon. So places with the passive system, those trucks I showed you, discharge into there. It remains primarily frozen over the entire winter. Then once things begin to thaw, sometimes manually or sometimes just naturally, these lagoons are drained, and they typically will then be fed into a tundra wetland system, which will provide some more natural treatment until, again, finally a marine discharge. So these systems do provide some treatment, but the key things to remember as we're talking about exposure are that it's a very low removal of pathogenic microorganisms. And with the mechanical systems specifically, given the conditions in the Arctic, operational failure is very common. And when something does break, it can often take a long time to repair it, just given finding the parts, technical expertise, etc. So the mechanical systems are really prone to failed treatment. And then with both of these systems, as I said, we're discharging to wetland and marine environments that are near communities. And so why is that so important? Inuit rely on the local environment as their source of food. It's an extension of their pantry, it's an extension of their living space. So we have a few examples here. Just some shellfish harvesting is very common in many of the communities, particularly on Baffin Island, where they have very, very high and low tides. We have ATV travel through a wetland area. So as I mentioned, many of these passive systems also include a tundra wetland as part of the treatment train. And it's not uncommon because people aren't always familiar that that's actually part of the treatment system. So you do see ATV travel through there, shore recreation, fishing, kids playing, that kind of thing. And then as well, food harvesting in the wetland. So this is an example of collecting geese eggs. Berry harvesting and things like this are also really common in those wetland areas. So when you combine these 2 things, basic wastewater treatment plants, discharging effluent, a population that's really reliant on their local environment as a source of food, you have the potential for contamination and human exposure. And so I'm not going to go into great detail about the methodology, but of course I'd be very happy to speak with anybody in more detail if they're interested. To understand these exposures and characterize the risk, I followed a quantitative microbial risk assessment. So this is a standard method. It involves 4 steps. So the first one being the hazard identification. So I had indicator E. coli data that had been collected at various points. So at the direct discharge point, as well as numerous locations in the receiving environment. And we use that indicator E. coli data as a surrogate to use ratios to sorry, we use the indicator E. coli ratios to understand the potential pathogenic E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, rotavirus, Giardia, and Cryptosporidium. So those are 6 fairly common enteric pathogens that are found often in wastewater. And the second step being, we needed to actually understand not just what was happening when these pathogens were being released directly from the wastewater treatment areas, because it was well known that those are toxic areas. We needed to understand the fate and transport of these pathogens further out into the environment where people might be exposed. So to do that, we did some first order kinetic modeling using some linear regression. And then of course, human activity parameters. So we needed to understand what actually were people doing in these areas? How often were we there? So I'm going to come back to that point on the next slide to talk more specifically. But to the third step was the dose response assessment. So these are established models from the literature. We've been hearing a little bit more about dose response in the last year, but essentially what it means is if someone is exposed to this dose of a particular pathogen, the probability of them becoming infected and then becoming ill increases, and there's specific models for specific pathogens. Then the fourth step being risk characterization. So this is where all those pieces of information are brought together into a simulation model, a Monte Carlo model in particular, and you can arrive at your probability of illness for a given exposure. So I said I wanted to speak a little more about the exposure assessment step. And in particular within that step, understanding how people are exposed, what activities are leading people to come into contact with wastewater effluent in their local environment. So a lot of risk assessment studies rely specifically on standard values that come from EPA guides and other sources. But a lot of this information wasn't directly relevant and didn't really apply to the lifestyle in these Inuit communities. So this was a novel modification to the standard model. So the exposure scenarios and parameters, instead of relying purely on literature-based scenarios, we need to capture some localized knowledge and description to understand the picture. So this involved working with 5 communities in Nunavut: Iqaluit, Nayat, Pangertung, Pond Inlet, and Sanitation. And across those communities in total, I conducted 42 key informant questionnaires, and each of those questionnaire sessions also involved some mapping. The key informants included people like the local food harvesters and fishers, the people who operate these wastewater treatment areas, as well as people who do work in health services in the community, and also as well, we brought this information to the broader community forum. So you can see about 100 members attended over a variety of sessions where we kind of had some preliminary ideas about these are the exposure scenarios that we think are taking place. Does this sound about right? So it was a chance for people to kind of see where things were at and make some adjustments and say, well, that's not right. Actually, you know, we do our berry picking over here, that kind of thing. And as well, disseminating that research and sharing that with the community. In particular, this photo on the bottom is using the medium of radio. So that's still very common in some of these smaller communities. So through this more participatory research, we're able to engage the community more, these communities overall, but also tailor and adjust the exposure scenarios and parameters that went into the model. And so what were the important exposure scenarios? So what you're meant to take away from these tables are just what was going on in each community. So across the top in the black bar, I have the 5 communities that I mentioned. In the darkest gray bar, those are the types of wastewater treatment systems that they have. So you can see Iqaluit and Pangertung are using those mechanical treatment systems, and then passive systems being used in the other three. In the light gray, these were some particular conditions that turned out being really important in these sites. They were important in terms of what people were doing at those times. These seasonal or tidal conditions often dictated the type of activities, and they were also important from a wastewater treatment perspective. And then the rest of the rows are the particular activities. So these were the ways people were exposed: shore recreation, boating, net fishing, shellfish harvesting in some communities, and wetland travel in others. And now what this version of the table is showing is, after that risk assessment model was used, anything highlighted now in orange generated over 100 expected annual cases of gastrointestinal illness. So for example, in Iqaluit, during low tide, if you were in the shore recreation group, people who fit into that exposure group, there was expected over 100 annual cases of illness due to that exposure. So these would be the highest groups here highlighted in orange. We can see shellfish consumption being important in both communities. Pangertung being entirely highlighted in orange is quite alarming, and we'll see a bit more about that in a moment. And then as well, even in the passive systems, which we do find to be a better fit in Arctic conditions, we do still have a high risk scenario in Nunavut during the springtime, when those lagoons and ponds I showed you are beginning to melt and everything is rushing through the wetland. It did indicate a high risk scenario for wetland travel. And so now, taking some of that information from the table and putting the risk characterization numbers to it, what we have here on the left are the maximum exposure conditions. So under those conditions, these are the expected amounts, the expected incidence. So these are the cases of gastrointestinal illness per person that could be expected in these communities. And then we have the Iqaluit, Pangertung, Pond Inlet, Sanitation, and Nunavut, the communities on the x-axis. And these dotted lines, if you recall, I showed you at the beginning of the presentation a self-reported epidemiology study talking about total food and waterborne exposure in Inuit communities. So the range that they had was 2.9 to 3.9. In that second bar, Pangertung, that was a community that was highlighted all those orange scenarios. You could see that under worst case conditions, every person in the community would be expected to have 5 episodes of gastrointestinal illness that were directly related to wastewater exposure. So that's extremely high. Iqaluit, Pond Inlet, and Sanitation, you could expect that if the total food and waterborne illness was 2.9 to 3.9 episodes per person per year, those are probably somewhat reasonable estimates of the amount that could relate to wastewater exposure. And then our last community, Nunavut, at 1.2, still very high, but probably reasonable within that estimated range. For the next stage of the research, what I did was we needed to move from just these 5 community case studies to a more generalizable inferential risk model. And to do so, that involved going from point estimated variables to probability distributions. And rather than these incidence rates that I just highlighted for each community, we needed something more comparable to global health benchmarks relating to waterborne disease. And it was also important to move not just assessing the risk, but ways it can be managed. And so I won't really talk about the specifics, the technical part of the model as we did so as much there, but again, I'm happy to talk about that if it's of interest to anyone. What I think I'll spend the last time on for the research presentation is actually on the mitigations. So we came up with 2 potential mitigations, one being improved treatment. So this would be very expensive, very cost prohibitive in a territory that already has a lot of demands and is dealing with a lot of issues. So that would obviously reduce the initial pathogen concentration, however, going back into the environment. The second type of mitigation was a behavioral change. And that doesn't just include individuals' behavior, but operational changes to the existing systems. So I'll give you an example of one of those. One of the behavioral changes that a community suggested that they already have implemented is when they wait to empty that lagoon until after the Arctic char season is over. So after they have returned and are starting to swim back upriver. And why that was important is because that was a really important time when everybody's out in the community. There's a lot of fishing. The migration path is directly past where this wastewater treatment lagoon is being drained to. So by simply holding off as long as they can in the fall, so fish can pass by, but before freeze up, can really, it's shown to be an effective mitigation. And it was a way to lower exposure frequencies. And then there were some other things where we could also increase the distance to the exposure locations through things like fencing and public health messaging, just indicating that these are treatment areas. And so this is just a box plot, just kind of meant to show the impact of some of these mitigations. So what we have here is the annual probability of illness associated with shellfish harvesting, mechanical treatment, low tide scenario. So this was one of those scenarios from the table that you may remember was high risk. And that first box is just the baseline conditions. And then we can see both mitigation 1, which was improved treatment, or mitigation 2, which was the behavioral change, also reduce risk. And I had talked about needing to find a global health guideline. So the most lenient World Health Organization guideline is 10 to the minus 3. So that's a still 1 in 1,000 risk of illness if you're in those exposure groups. For any type of risk assessment, that's still extremely lenient. 10 to the minus 4, even 10 to the minus 6. So 1 in a million is a lot more common. But you can see that these mitigations are effective from 10.3 and even getting below 10.-4. And this was for pathogenic E. coli specifically. And I just have one more of the same graph, this one for rotavirus. So a different pathogen. You can see the baseline was higher to start with, just as it's a more infectious pathogen. And again, the mitigations reduced it below that WHO guideline for the most part. So just a quick summary of what the contributions of this were. Through this work, we provided the first estimates of human health risks associated with wastewater treatment in Arctic Canada, and contributed to the understanding of food and waterborne illness risk factors in Arctic communities. And so what does that mean? Why are those two things important? Well, if you remember back at the beginning, I told you that we don't have very good health data about specific conditions, specific diseases in the Arctic. This provides some information that can be useful on its own, but to contribute to those areas. And it's important to understand the risk of food and waterborne illness because we saw how important these communities, wild food harvesting is still such an important part of daily life that understanding the risk can help us continue to do that safely. And as a novel modification, we applied the risk assessment in a community setting, adapted with participatory methods. That brought in some socio-ecological perspectives. And then I just wanted to mention a few ideas. Many of this type of work is all interdisciplinary and I think fits well with the types of things that go on at the Climate Change Institute. So these are just some direct follow-up research on water, sanitation, and Inuit health. There's still these highest risk exposure scenarios that I talked about, shellfish harvesting, for example. There's a lot more tailored risk assessment that can be done specific to those areas. Drinking water security and household water reuse systems, I think, is a really important topic in these regions. comparative studies at that water health nexus, not just in Arctic Canada, but with similar communities in Alaska and Greenland. I have some colleagues doing work in those areas, and there's certainly a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of interesting differences as well. So I think there's some lessons to be learned. Emerging point source pollutants in Arctic communities in general. So through this work, what was kind of interesting is there is certainly a lot of research on non-point source pollutants in the Arctic, but things like wastewater and as well solid waste management, indoor and even outdoor air quality from things like dust in the summer are issues that a lot of people identified as really important to their day-to-day life. And then as well with climate change, permafrost thaw, the release of legacy toxic pollutants is certainly an important issue in Nunavut and across the Arctic. Some broader research interests that fit into the research program that I talked about at the beginning that I thought might be of interest to people at CCI. These are just some are early ideas, some are projects currently in development. So environmental health risk assessment modeling across rural, remote, marginalized, and data limited communities. So I talked a little bit about how the risk assessment models were adapted to Inuit communities in Nunavut specifically, but there's a lot of types of communities and populations where I think risk assessment modeling could be really useful with some novel adaptations. The impacts of climate change on water systems and health in coastal communities specifically, both large water systems and decentralized systems, so wells and septic, environmental exposures and water recreation, for example, in Maine, lakes, surfing, fishing, these kind of different exposures. And a couple projects in development with people at UMaine are some connections between these constructed treatment wetlands and that I talked about, the passive systems and vector-borne disease. And as well, health risks associated with PFAS contaminated wastewater residuals. So these forever chemicals that are now being found in biosolids and wastewater residuals that have been applied to dairy farms and are now looking for new management strategies. And just before I open it up, I'm really looking forward to questions and discussion, but I did want to take a moment and first thank all of you again. Thank Marcy and the Policy Center as well. And of course, the communities and people who I worked with during this specific research in Iqaluit, Nayat, Sanitation, Pangertung, and Pond Inlet are my partners in the government of Nunavut and some research institutes there, and as well as some co-authors. Thanks very much. I guess, Marcy, I'll take my screen down. I think you might still be muted.
Be happy to moderate any discussion and questions that you have of Kiley. Paul?
Thank you. Kiley, that was wonderful. It's really great to get that sort of perspective. I don't think that most of us have that. And obviously living in these areas was very complete, worthwhile. Obviously you can't cover everything, but maybe you could comment on this. I've heard that marine mammals are a tremendous source of toxic substances. And one of the primary, because of course they tend to consolidate them, concentrate them in their bodies. And I've heard that there's a direct relationship between that and the fact that Inuits have a particularly high rate of cancer. Is that correct?
Contamination and marine mammals is certainly an issue. As far as cancer rates specifically, I do think there are rates of certain cancers that are certainly of major concern. As far as anything with marine mammals is an absolute high priority in these communities. So we did specific to, so yes, in general, major concern on contaminants. As far as it relates to that specific research, we did try to find out a bit more about chemicals and other things coming, as well as pathogens coming from these point sources, like wastewater pollutants. We just didn't really have the understanding in the models as far as how it related to fin fish and marine mammals. So specific to these types of contaminants, we didn't include that. But as I said to your broader question, certainly, yeah, given the diet, mercury contamination within marine mammals has certainly been an issue for a long time. And it's very, just as kind of interesting from the public health side of that is the messaging and the way that's been communicated. Again, when it's such an important part of the lifestyle and the diet, I know there's some really specific tailored public health advice concerning marine mammal, suggested amounts, particularly for pregnant women and things like that, trying to strike that perfect balance in alignment with the diet.
Thank you. Just one other quick question, because of your broad experience in this field. It sounds as if Canada is being quite proactive recently in investigating these sorts of things. What about Greenland? Do you think that there's similar sorts of studies going on in Greenland? Are they a good model, or do they need to learn more? Not Greenland so much, but Denmark and Greenland, I should say.
Right. Yeah, so I can say a little bit about that. So one of my, who's a co-author on some of this work, and at the time was a member of my PhD supervisory committee, is a microbiologist named Dr. Elizabeth Truelstrup Hansen, who's at DTU, the Denmark Technical University. And through her, with her, I was able to participate in about a week-long exchange field course kind of thing in a community called Sympsoium, Greenland. And it was wonderful. We went there and talked about, the kind of stuff I just talked about now. And there were others from Alaska and other Nordic countries. And it was really interesting to learn. So on Greenland specifically, to be honest, they have the same type of system as far as how water gets to your house and wastewater gets taken out of your house. To be honest, they're not as concerned about wastewater. The communities that we saw use a very long pipe with a diffuser at the end and discharge directly into the ocean, other than maybe some basic filtration with no treatment whatsoever. But where they are really concerned kind of in this sort of research area is more on their solid waste and hazardous waste. So I would say there are similar studies with that distinction. They've kind of been talking to us saying, you guys really, you don't need to worry as much about your wastewater. What you need to worry about in these communities and what's potentially more hazardous is the way you're managing or not managing your solid waste dumps, including hazardous waste.
Thank you. Just when I moved to Maine in 2000 to the coast, there are fewer now, but there were still plenty of houses that all of their wastewater, solid and liquid, went right into the ocean, not far from their house either. Amazing. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Yes.
Mark?
On the lagoons, to what extent are lagoons practical across the communities that now have mechanical systems? And how much work or thought has gone into the design of the lagoons? Prior to being a grad student, I spent most of my career as a water design engineer and a year living in St. Mary's, a Inuit village in Alaska. So I have some appreciation of the problems of mechanical systems in those environments. But I know that lagoons, they can be effective or not effective depending on how they're designed and operated.
Yeah, you said it. I think you have more understanding of that specific element, the design and engineering element, than I. So what I can say in Nunavut is The only places, the few communities that are still exploring or sticking by their mechanical treatment plants are those that don't have the space or the particular terrain where a lagoon and wetland system can be used. It's an expensive technology. As I said, it's kind of fraught with problems. I think they're trying to get rid of them where they can. So the ones that are still using them, it seems to be a space and siting issue. All the communities are important. What's kind of interesting is Iqaluit, which is the capital, which the population continues to grow, as the capital people are drawn there. So they're up to 7,000 or 8,000 people, and they are one of the communities that does have a mechanical plant that essentially does nothing but some very basic primary screening, and then discharges into quite a accessible and widely used bay. I think it's been a decade-long battle, often involving legal issues on what's going to happen with that plant.
Is anyone doing disinfection of the effluent?
I don't think there's any disinfection in that. There's no disinfection in any of the lagoons, and I don't think there's any. I'm certain at the time of this study there was no disinfection stage.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question from Paloma about the possibility of using composting toilets, or whether the freezing temperatures make that impossible.
Yeah, composting toilets specifically, I'm not really certain. That fits into an area that I think is really important, and I'm quite interested in, though, is more sustainable and can often be very basic systems for water reuse and different ideas of treatment. So, these lagoons are advantageous in many ways, but they're not ideal. And on the water reuse side, I'm talking about within the home. So when you have this truck system, as you may or may not know, as in many Indigenous communities, overcrowding and these types of things are certainly an issue there. So you may have a home with a water tank that's probably meant to provide ample daily water for 4 people, and you could have upwards of 10 people living there. But the water tank stays the same size, obviously. So anything water reuse, different wastewater treatment technologies, I think are certainly a really, really good research topic for the Arctic communities.
Are there other questions?
I'm wondering, you touched a little bit on seasonal problems, such as the Arctic char run. Is there any other seasonal problems with running a lagoon and pond system, where I'm imagining they freeze in the winter and then most of the decomposition happens in the very short spring to summer? Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so that's exactly the case. So the idea is it is frozen, the lagoon is frozen over the winter, and I would say the main issue is that the idea is to try to keep the lagoon, the effluent in the lagoon as long as possible during that warmer season when you have near 24-hour daylight, to increase the potential for treatment before discharging. So as far as the seasonal issues, what can often happen is, as Mark alluded to, some of these lagoons are engineered, as in purposely built. As I mentioned, I think some are just existing ponds that may have had a gravel berm built up at some point. So in trying to keep the effluent in there as long as possible over the summer, that doesn't always work. So one of the seasonal issues being, as soon as the fall starts, sometimes you have everything draining out, which obviously is a major contaminant and exposure risk. And as the patterns of thaw and the seasonal patterns become less predictable, there's major issues there as well. So if everything obviously thaws too quickly, you can have these berms overflowing and breaking, leading to just complete wash everything out at once directly through the wetland with no retention time. So as these seasonal patterns become less predictable, those issues are increasing.
Any other questions?
Well, hearing none, I just want to remind everybody that we'll be back in a week. We once again have some talks by graduate students. See you all there. And thank you, Kiley, very much. Great talk.
Thanks, everyone.